Hi everyone and welcome to the live stream. I'm here with a special guest, Scott, and we're going to talk about a topic that I have been putting off for so long, UBI, Universal Basic Income. So before we begin, Scott, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, because you're the CEO of an organization and you also have written a book about money.
Yeah. I'm Scott Santens. Thanks for having me on today. I've been talking about universal basic income for over a decade now. I got into it back in 2013, and more recently, I founded my new nonprofit, Income to Support All Foundation, or ITSA Foundation for short. Directly, actually, as a result of the release of ChatGPT, I felt that like the time had arrived where basically traditional pushing for UBI was like too late, and we needed to do more faster. And I needed to leverage like everything I could to accelerate this. So that was behind the launch of Income to Support Our Foundation. And yeah, I wrote a book called Let There Be Money. It's a very short book. The the point of it really is to just like to give people a tool, something that they could read in a little over an hour and be able to like really share with others.
If you have a
Here's
copy,
one
that'd be
sec.
great. Perfect. Yes.
Yeah, like Let There Be Money. You can find it on Amazon. I specifically made it like very cheap and specifically to hand it out to people, like at groups, and like have meetings about it and talk and stuff. But it's not so much like a whole deep thing into basic income, because that would take like a really long time and be like a much bigger book. It's really just kind of like introducing people to like what is money, and essentially what is the best way to distribute it, and what taxes really are. Just kind of like a quick summary of universal basic income and MMT actually.
So let's jump into the topic itself. So what is UBI?
Yeah, so universal basic income or unconditional basic income is a UBI, and it's five defining characteristics. Is that it's unconditional, so that means no work requirements. And it's universal, so essentially no means tests. It goes to everyone, rich or poor, and it needs to be frequently distributed, and it needs to be to individuals instead of like households, and it needs to be cash. So those are the five defining characteristics of UBI.
And why should we be moving in the direction of issuing UBIs, or why should governments even consider such an idea?
So there's a lot of reasons why UBI makes sense, even just from like a very efficient kind of safety net perspective. There's reasons why, let's say, work requirements doesn't make sense for like any benefit. Like if it doesn't increase work, what's the point of it? If you're spending a lot of more money to administration, like what's the point of that? If the test that you're doing means that you're excluding tons of people that you mean to include, what's the point of that? Um, I would say at this point in time, universal basic income is just super important, because I would say economic inequality has reached way beyond extreme levels, to the point where it's actively ripping apart society. Like I would say that's behind uh, a lot of the polarization, the partisanship, the rise of authoritarianism around the world. And now it's just going to get worse with artificial intelligence and the automation of labor. You're just going to see some small percentage of people getting much wealthier, even more so than the past decades. And there's going to be a lot more people being left behind, losing out, and that causes anger, uh, and that causes, loss of faith, erosion of society. And we're just going to see a lot more problems as a result, until we get that nice, stable foundation under everyone, where you can actually reduce that stress, reduce that anger, reduce the inequality, and make sure, everyone's benefiting instead of being hurt by automation.
Because as we're seeing with, for example, with AI, ChatGTP, and other bots and other chat tools, um, there's story after story. I think also this week, Ford, the CEO of Ford Motor Company, was talking about laying off thousands of staff because he could rely on automation, or he could rely on AI to do this work. So why are we hearing the opposite from governments who are talking about, also in the US, so I'm just thinking of over in Europe, where we're hearing government after government talking about moving people off benefits, off entitlements into jobs, and also with the big beautiful bill this week, one of the was that Medicare requirements included work requirements, so people would have to work more, or they'd have to take up employment. So why are we hearing more from governments about moving people off benefits into jobs when in reality we're hearing on the other side AI is taking a lot of jobs? So how do we square that circle? Or like, why are governments doing
Yeah,
this?
I would say that there's just a lot of elite capture by special interests. There, this goes to even like the reasoning of why we haven't seen basic income decades ago. Like even like Nixon was pushing a version of basic income back in the 70s, and there was a bill that passed the House in 1970 and 1971. Didn't make it through the Senate either time, but if it would have, Nixon would have signed it into law, and the U.S. would have been, the first country to lead the way with a guaranteed basic income for families. What it would have started with. But the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, when asked about, when expressing his opposition to this, was like, "Who will iron my shirts?" His, that concern is like, if people can actually say no to low wages, then maybe people have to pay more, and if you're relying on low wage labor, if you're relying on people being desperate, then that's where like you can actually pay very low wages for people. If people gain the power to actually refuse bad conditions, then suddenly you have to improve those conditions. Wages need to go up. I think we saw a version of this during the pandemic too, when people were like, "Oh, we can't find anyone to work anymore." And it's like, well, the companies that raised their wages had no problem finding people to
Yes.
work. It was the companies that didn't, that had those problems. Um, so it's really just like a power differential. And I think that that's really what, UBI gets at, is it redistributes power from the top downwards. And if you're at the top and you've gained power through the status quo, you're not going to want to disrupt the status quo. So I think that's kind of really what the main issue is when it comes to politicians, because they're answering to their donors, and their donors don't necessarily want that.
And before I want to ask you in a moment about the difference between a UBI and a negative income tax, but I just want to tell everyone this is a live stream. So if you want to ask any questions, if you want me to ask any questions to Scott, I will do that for you. So Scott, what is so some people have suggested instead of going down the route of a UBI, what about using a negative income tax? So can you maybe explain what is a negative income tax and why a UBI will be better?
Yeah, so first of all, like a lot of people who talk about negative income tax, I think they know that Milton Friedman was a supporter of negative income tax. And some of them will even say, oh, he supported negative income tax, but not a universal basic income. But actually, he was directly asked about this and in an interview, and he said that there are two ways of doing the same thing. And he was actually even a member of the Basic Income Earth Network. Like he actually directly supported basic income. Um, the difference is that so negative income tax phases out. So let's say the full amount, let's say we're looking at a $1,500 per month UBI versus negative income tax. Um, Negative income tax, the full amount would go to someone earning $0, and then there'd be a phase out rate. So with each dollar earned, there would be a loss of some amount of their payment. And Milton Friedman, we usually talk about a 50% phase out rate just because like the math is easier, but it necessarily doesn't have to be that. It could be 40%, 30%, 20%, whatever. But the point is that that phases out. And the reasoning for a lot of people thinking that that's better is that they think it's cheaper, so that you're distributing less money, so therefore you have to raise less money in taxes, so therefore that makes more sense. And the thing is that with a universal basic income, it's always going to be paired with some kind of tax. And those taxes also function as a phase out rate. Um, it's just that it's, weirdly speaking, negative income tax, the phase out isn't seen as a tax, but with basic income, it is. And I just think that's kind of a confusion. If you give people if you give someone $100 and then tax back $50, then they end up with 50 and you've spent 50. And if you hand them $50, then you hand them $50 and it works out the same way. But the thing is, with the negative income tax and versus UBI, I think the UBI is better, is that negative income tax will always the phase out will always be a tax on those in the phase out range. So if you do a 50% phase out, then you're applying a 50% marginal tax rate for those in that range. And I just think it makes more sense to move that marginal tax rate and lower it across the board. Like you want the rich paying more because they're actually less impacted by marginal tax rates too. And at the lower end, they're more impacted. So you want to lower that out. And also with the universal basic income, you can use all sorts of taxes to function as the phase out rate, whereas a negative income tax will always be essentially a tax on income. And I think that's like one of the worst taxes that you can do. You want to move towards taxing other things, and UBI enables more of that.
Um, One of the arguments also put up against a UBI is, well, why are we giving money to rich people? Shouldn't we focus more on the poorest in society? So what would be your argument against that? And then I'm going to get to a question from Animation Deer in just a moment. So what's the argument against, well, why give it to everyone and just give it to those who actually need it?
Yeah, so to answer that, just a little bit more with the negative income tax. Imagine like there's that point where let's say it's $100,000, and so let's say you design a negative income tax so that it phases out, and then someone at $100,000 is getting zero. Well, a UBI could effectively do the same thing, where at that point, at $100,000, someone is paying, say, $15,000 to receive $15,000. So, on their taxes, it's like a $15,000 credit. They owe $15,000. It nets out to zero. So it's the same thing. Above that point are all your net payers. So if you're a billionaire, then you're going to be paying much more in taxes than you're receiving in basic income. And it just makes more sense to do it that way because first of all, you're not really necessarily paying and getting back. It could just be all a line item on your taxes. Um, but if you include everybody, then you make sure that you don't exclude anyone. And that's the issue with a lot of this, any kind of means tested program, is that, if you say, oh, I want only the poor to get this. Well, if you look at program after program, it'll say like, it'll exclude 3 to 4 people who should get that benefit. And just over and over again, it's around 3 out of 4. It can be 1 out of 4, 2 out of 4, 1 out of 5, whatever. But you're excluding so many people that should get this. And you're doing that for multiple reasons. So first of all, there's not passing the tests. So it's like a bureaucratic problem, paper problem. But also it can be the stigma attached. So if you target something, then suddenly you're saying that, oh, like you're someone who needs this, like I need help, but I don't need help. That's only for those people. So it creates that kind of social barrier to something. And if you make sure
Yeah,
everyone has this, then there's
yeah,
nothing.
a little bit like free school meals in schools, where the richer kids don't need them, and there isn't the stigma attached, or they don't have the stigma attached to them because they don't need to rely on the food stamps, or they don't need to rely on the support from the state. Well, there is a lot of stigma attached to
Right.
kids who are poor. So if you give it to everyone, then you remove that stigma. Sorry, yeah,
Right.
continue.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. I loved how even when Walls was part of the conversation and he kind of went viral here in the US during that campaign, he was actually talking about universality and why it made sense for school lunches. And that's a really important reason. Um, and also, so like during the pandemic, this was a good understanding, I think, of universality happened there too, was that so if you do a negative income tax or if you do any kinds of tests, then you're requiring to have that data at some point beforehand. So like in when the pandemic happened, we were using income data from like 2 years prior. So because this was like early 2020, people hadn't filed their taxes yet. So you're using 2019 or 2018 data. And because of that, like all sorts of people, their incomes were not what they used to be. And so you weren't actually looking at what people needed right at that moment. And so if you have universal basic income, that's always there. And then you just test on the back end with taxes. So it's always looking backwards, and you can always modify, the net receipt of basic income based on whatever happened between, that point and then when they file taxes. But with a negative income tax or some other pre-tested benefit, you're always going to be messing up on those numbers at the time of need and excluding so many people again, and that time through that lag of testing.
Yeah, so like somebody could be, in a well-paying job this year, but lose their job,
Right.
and then next year they wouldn't be eligible for the negative income tax. I just want to read this comment from Animation Deer, who says, "What levers does society have to make a UBI happen when it seems incredibly difficult to even get massive corporations to pay taxes in the first place?" So yeah, how are we going to convince societies or governments to adopt a UBI? Maybe, as you said at the beginning, I don't know if we had it on the recording or not, but how, while in the past there was not much appetite, maybe during the pandemic, people started talking more about UBI. And then now with automation, AI, I think more and more governments and politicians are discussing UBI, including Andrew Yang, who you were speaking to recently.
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, and it's kind of like the key question is how do we actually do this? I firmly believe that there is a lot of support for this, like grassroots support. Like if you do polling, depending on how you ask it, you're usually going to get like a majority of people who support this. The question is like the elected representatives, those in power, and of course who they're answering to. That's the challenge. So the question goes along with how do you actually make sure governments are responsive to people? Andrew Yang, yeah, he's a friend of mine, and what he's been focused on is uh, what he learned through the process of running for president is he thought that, well, the system is basically broken. It's not listening to people, so he wants to fix the system so that it listens to people. So he's been focusing on increasing the power of a third party to actually modify how things get done. Like if he can actually get a couple independent members of Congress that are willing to buck against like traditional power structures, elites, not be like traditional left or right, then you can actually get more things done. So that's his thinking, and I think that part of that's correct. Like anything that can make government more responsive to people, I think would actually help get this done and other things done. I also think that there are like baby steps that you can do. And although I fully support, like, let's just do a full-on basic income, and that's the way to do it. Um, Anything you can do, like if you take a benefit and universalize it, I think that's good. So, like in the UK, I know there's been some issues there that's been like back and forth, and now there's like going against the party, and people are getting in trouble over what they were going to do. Like when you look at like what was it the senior the
Winter
senior
fuel,
payment,
yeah, the winter fuel
right? The winter
allowance.
fuel payment,
Mm.
right, right. So that's like a great example of how this can actually uh, popularize universality. So if you restrict something that is universal, especially for some group, that's a very unpopular, you do it to like save money, but then, oh, look what happens is people get really pissed off. You're excluding lots of people that need it. You're drawing arbitrary lines. So going the reverse, like if you can find something like a child allowance, and it's like somehow targeted, or that's another thing in the UK too, like the two-child benefit cap or whatever. Like if you go back and just say, no, 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 no two-child benefit cap, just making sure each kid gets this, that is a better policy. Just make sure that everyone gets something and then focus on taxes to make sure that those with higher incomes don't necessarily benefit, if that's like your main concern is making sure like someone doesn't benefit from something. Just like with school lunches, like make sure every kid gets it and then just charge the parents of rich kids more so that they're effectively, not getting the same benefit. So any kind of like kind of step towards that direction. Same with work requirements. If you can actually remove the work requirements from something, And you'll show that, oh, look, like people didn't stop working, that there wasn't like some impact on working less. We actually just included more people. That's a good thing too. And it's just a matter of what you can do along those lines. Same thing with like switching from something that isn't cash to cash. Here in the US, like there's a housing voucher. HUD is looking at doing cash instead of a voucher. So if you can like test that and go, oh, look, cash actually works better or just as well and it's cheaper than this other thing, let's do cash. So there's all those different ways of doing this better. And I think those are all good steps.
I'm just looking at some of the questions in the chat. Somebody's asking about inflation. So, like, let's say we did introduce a UBI. Let's say an example you gave at the beginning was maybe $1,500. How would you protect people against inflation? Would the UBI be linked to inflation? So, if inflation went up 3%, for example, the UBI would go up accordingly, or how would we deal? One of the other questions that's normally put forward is, I didn't see it in chat today, but I've heard it before, is, well, a UBI will add to inflation because you'll have all this money flowing around, and this will add to inflation. So how would you respond to those points?
Yeah, so it's important to have a strong understanding of basic income, which kind of helps answer those things. So one of them is the inflation concern. A lot of people think that basic income is, let's say, expanding the money supply with like no taxation to take money out. So let's say it's everyone gets a boost of $1,000 per month or whatever, and that's it. So if you think about it that way, of course there's going to be inflation because you've expanded the money side beyond that. But like if you distribute $1,000 per month and you've also taxed out of the system the same amount or somewhere near that amount, it doesn't need to be the same, but somewhere near that, you can actually have stable inflation in regards to the amount of money supply. That's not to say that there aren't impacts about like how, there's a way that the rich spend their money and there's a way that the rest of the people spend their money. So, let's say if someone rich has $1 million, then, yachts are going to be more expensive. But if you distribute out to a bunch of people, then maybe what they spend on could exceed the supply constraints for certain things, in which case prices could go up for those things. I would argue that I don't think the economy is working appropriately if people actually don't have the ability to express demand for basic needs, goods, and services. You want an economy that can meet everyone's basic needs. So if the supply is overrun by demand by making sure people can buy food, then clearly like the country isn't like producing enough food, and that's actually a healthy signal. Like you want to make sure that that signal is out there. So I would argue too that basic income actually makes markets work better because you're actually making sure that everyone can express demand for basic goods and services so that the economy meets those demands. Um, but then, so when it comes to inflation too, there are so many factors involved, and I would say like it's certainly a concern. Like you could do a UBI in a way that will guarantee to increase inflation, but also you can do it in smart ways that are far less likely to do that. One of those ways is to just be kind of more deficit neutral, so you're maxing it with taxes, so you're not inflating the money supply. But also, so, the amount of UBI matters. Like there's a small amount that wouldn't impact inflation, and there's a large amount that would. So, finding that balance there is important, and increasing it over time makes sense. Um, oh, to answer your other question too, like Social Security already has those cost of living adjustments here in the US. So, I advise that any UBI policy should be indexed to at least inflation. I would prefer it grow with like GDP per capita so that everyone is actually seeing like a percentage of overall economic growth instead of just keeping up with inflation. But there's so many other factors when it comes to inflation. Like you want other policies involved too. You want to have policies that uh, enable people to increase supply better. You don't want restrictive like housing policies that make it hard to increase supply when it comes to housing. Um,
Yeah, because that's
it's
one of
just it,
that's one of the arguments that we often hear is, well, if you give people $1,000 a month, well, their landlord will just put up the rent by $500. So
right.
how would you deal with that, or is that a legitimate concern people have?
Oh yeah, no, that's another, it's a big question when it comes to, inflation. People are specifically concerned about housing. And for good reason. I mean, we've seen that housing is just ridiculous when it comes to the ability of landlords to raise the rent, you know? So personally, I really like the idea of land value tax to go alongside UBI. For those who aren't familiar with what that is, that just means that you're taxing the unimproved value of land. So imagine if there's like a skyscraper next to an empty parking lot in a city and they're both the same size land, then, the both of those are going to be charging the same to the owners. And the person with the skyscraper, they're actually making maximum use of that land. Whereas the one with the empty lot, they can't actually afford to keep it an empty lot. They're going to actually have to develop it into a skyscraper or sell it to someone who will because they can't hold on to that. But right now with property taxes, you can actually hold on to like vacant pieces of land and it can be pretty cheap because right now we're taxing what you build on land essentially. So it actually you're punished for developing, land and maximizing that capacity under current circumstances. So I think that's what taxes are to like modify these incentives and to like have good incentives versus bad incentives. So land value tax is one of those ways. But then there's also like reforms like here in the US, let's say you have like an area of a housing community and you're not allowed to actually build anything but single family homes. So that you're actually restricting that and keeping supply low. So remove those restrictions. This is like, YIMBY versus NIMBY, yes in my backyard versus no in my backyard. These policies that are considered YIMBY, I'm for, like, let's actually make sure we can build more housing. Um, but also when it comes to rent too, people are forgetting some kind of like some impacts of that. So, if you distribute UBI, you actually enable people to move to other locations. Like you're much more mobile with basic income. You're less tied to cities because right now cities are where the jobs are. So that's one of the reasons why rent is so expensive in cities because lots of people need to go there for jobs to survive. So if you decouple survival from work, then suddenly you can actually move anywhere in the country and more rural areas and still, do well. You can create jobs there. So I expect that to be one adjustment, so that rents would actually go up in those cheaper places and rents would go down to the expensive places. So you'd see kind of
A
a
balance.
rebalancing there. Right. And also when it comes to homeownership, one of the impacts of the pilots in the 70s was that they saw increased homeownership rates. And that just makes sense too. If you have more money, if you're more financially secure, you're going to be more likely to buy a home. And so I expect there to be more homeowners with a basic income, and that means less renters, which means a lower, demand for rent, which means landlords are less able to charge exorbitant rents because there's fewer people looking. So there's all those sort of like knock-on effects too that people just focus on like, the current system versus what that looks like with basic income. And there's certainly some deflationary potential there.
How would it be paid for? So if we were to go down the road of a UBI, how would you mentioned before taxing the rich or redistribution? What other ways could, because we're potentially talking about a significant amount of money. I don't know if you've done a calculation for every citizen in the US. I don't know, probably from the age of 18 up. But we're talking about a significant amount of money. So where would this cash come from?
Yeah, so first of all, if we go back again to like the negative income tax understanding, I think thinking of a UBI as a negative income tax is the correct way of kind of like costing a basic income. Because again, if you're at that $100,000 point and you're paying 15,000 for 15,000, it's not actually costing 15,000 to the government to give that person $15,000 of UBI. Like it zeroes out. So you have to like calculate that for every person to see like what is the net increase or decrease in their incomes after taxes. And so if you go across and calculate out everybody to see what is the difference between what they're being taxed in new taxes and the basic income, then the cost of UBI is at a much lower than what the gross cost is, and that's like the real cost. So the net cost is usually, depending on the details, around like 30% what the gross cost is. So if anyone like quickly multiplies and says, oh, well, if you take, 300 million people and, give them $10,000 a year, and that's like a gross of $3 trillion, that's not the proper costing of a basic income. Instead, you have to do is essentially an integral or a summation of a series to figure out what is the sum difference between each one. And that's more like, say, $1 trillion. So if you're looking at like $1 trillion for a poverty eliminating basic income, it's still expensive. I'm not saying it's not, but it's much smaller than what people think it is. That's much more doable than thinking, oh, 3 trillion, 4 trillion, that's impossible. So that's one part of it. Another part is we need to think about how much we're spending to not have a basic income. Like, what are the full costs, downstream costs, especially of poverty, chronic insecurity, extreme inequality? You're paying through this through illness. You're paying for, higher insurance rates. You're paying for taxes for local hospitals and everything. Like, it's very expensive. So
And
basic income
also,
would actually
a lot of crime is related to poverty. So
exactly.
if you lift so many people out of poverty, you would see a drop in crime rates, which of course is very expensive to keep people in prison. Sorry, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, no, so those are the two biggest ones, illness and crime, that we're spending right now due to, not having a basic income floor. And we've seen these in basic income experiments, what these kind of differences look like. In the Canadian income experiments in the 1970s, hospitalization rates went down by about 9%. And so just imagine how much cheaper that is. And that was just for like, a quick 4 years. I think that when it comes to illness, over time, it's going to look like a healthier and healthier population. And it's over time, it's going to reduce what you're spending on a national healthcare system or any kind of health insurance at all. Those costs will go down. And then with crime, in the Namibia basic income experiment, their overall crime rate went down by 43%. And in the Canadian income experiment, overall crime went down 15% and violent crime went down 37%. So if you calculate that out and we're spending actually, well, trillions of dollars on crime and trillions of dollars on healthcare, then I would say that already balances out to, the $1 trillion that you need for universal basic income. So if you widen that picture out and look at what are we actually spending in total, big picture, basic income pays for itself. But then when it comes to like what taxes make the most sense, like what are the reforms to do? I've mentioned I like a land value tax. I think that's smart. I think we should tax stuff that we don't want and, tax income less. So, let's tax extreme wealth. Let's tax, besides land value, let's tax carbon. Let's tax things uh, that we want less of. We could do consumption taxes too, go well with basic income. Because without a basic income, consumption taxes are regressive, they hurt the poorest. But combined with basic income, then suddenly you're boosting the consumption power of, say, the bottom 60 to 80% of society, and you're reducing the consumption power of the top, say, 10 to 20%. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Like you should actually reduce consumption at the very, very top. And that's actually I would say that's really messing up the market mechanism. Like in the US right now, the top 10% are consuming actually 50% of all goods and services. So essentially, a majority of the economy is oriented around the demands and wants of the top 10%. But we want an economy that's oriented around the majority.
Yes.
So that's distortionary to actually have inequality be that large.
And questions come in from QA Library about benefits. So, what would happen to people who are on benefits when it comes to a UBI? So, would people lose their benefits? Would there be transition? Would some of those benefits remain, or as you call them in the United States, entitlements? So, what would happen to people in those situations? People on welfare or some other types of support?
Yeah, I think that there's discussion and debate to be had about which are the programs to keep in addition to UBI fully, which are the programs that can be adjusted because they were created absent UBI and they can look different with UBI, and which programs can be like fully replaced. Um, those are the three decisions to make depending on the policy. So, as an example, I look at disability supports, and I think disability makes sense to keep in addition to basic income because, there's always going to be less of an ability for someone who is disabled to actually, you know, earn the same amount as someone else who's fully abled. And so there's always going to be that difference. They're going to need that extra support. But then the amount of that extra support can vary. Like if there's already a lot of support for those with disabilities, then maybe that can go down a bit. And in if so to be combined with UBI, and also depending what the amount of that is. Um, but if it's too low, then it could make sense to just, fully keep it alongside the UBI. And then eventually the UBI could be so high that at some point maybe you could look at, well, they don't need as much. But that's a program where I think that you need both. But then like there's stuff like SNAP, food vouchers. And I don't think that makes sense to keep with the UBI as long as the UBI is high enough. So you want to always, I think, implement UBI with kind of a no harm implementation, that kind of thinking. So you don't want anyone worse off in poverty due to implementation. So it depends on what else is there. But I would say that, food vouchers, again, aren't as good as UBI. Um, like there's limitations on you can't spend SNAP on prepared foods except for like in cases of emergency where that's been approved. You can't spend it on these things that you need at the time that could be more than what that is. Like you need to have cash and you need to be able to spend it on anything. So if you have,
Isn't there? Sorry, just to interrupt for a
no, go ahead.
second. Yeah, isn't there this feeling we get from the government when it comes to support like that they don't trust people to
Oh
spend
yeah,
money in, and we always hear, particularly from right wing politicians, about how well people will just spend it on drugs and alcohol
right.
and waste this money when it's when you actually empower people. Yes, there will be some people who will use the money to. In a bad way, but obviously the majority of people would benefit if you just give them cash. They would be in a much better state to improve their lives.
Yeah, and there should be seen as like a conservative principle too. There's a
Mm,
great interview with Milton Friedman talking about it this way, where he's like, we're like, why treat people like a child when, if they have a food stamp, there's nothing stopping them from going out and selling the food stamp.
yeah.
So if you have like $100 of food stamps, you can sell those, but maybe you'll end up with $50 of cash instead of $100 of food stamps. So that's actually worse off for them, and you could have just given them cash. And yeah, when it comes to trusting people, we know like we have so much evidence when it comes to unconditional cash transfers, like all over the world. And like, so when it comes to drug use is one thing in particular, like it's such a big concern. Oh, people just use it on drugs. But you see over and over and over again, meta-analyses of this will show that drug use actually goes down slightly when it comes to unconditional cash transfers. Part of that is that a lot of drug abuse and these kind of addictive behaviors in general are due to like high stress. Like
Yes.
you're self-medicating when you're doing that. So if you can actually reduce that stress, then you're going to see less of those behaviors. And yeah, that's what you see over and over again.
Um, I'd like to talk more about some of the real benefits. So we talked about a bit about the nuts and bolts and how to fund it
Mhm.
and some of the costs related to it. But how would society change if we were to implement a UBI of say $1,000 or $1,500 tomorrow? So how would society be better off? How would ordinary people benefit from that?
Yeah, we've talked about how, health would improve. So physical health, mental health is a big one. Um, what I think is really interesting is I think epigenetically, people there'd be improvements. So epigenetically speaking, like if you look at kids born, so we know that if you're a child in the womb and your mom experiences like a drought, a hunger environment, high stress, then that's going to carry over to the child born, and that can alter the way that, even as adults that they exist. Like maybe it's easy for them to put on weight than what otherwise would have been the case. So we actually see these reductions in obesity as a result of this too. And we see that, kids are born with healthier birth weights. And so I think generation after generation with UBI, that would carry over like again and again. You would have babies born that were raised in less stressful womb environments. And I think that's going to have lots of positive implications. I would say too, we constantly see that there's greater entrepreneurship rates with basic income. Pretty big too. The Namibia UBI experiment that saw a 301% increase in entrepreneurship. The India pilots, the rates of entrepreneurship were triple in the experimental villages compared to the control villages.
And in those
Um,
in those cases, if I remember well, we're talking about very small amounts of money. We're not talking about $1,000 a month. We're talking about maybe $50 or $60 or something like that. Is that right?
yeah, yeah. Any amount of money helps people. First of all, it provides capital to those who want to start a business. It reduces risk aversion. So people, let's say they would start a business, but they fear, what happens if it fails? What's going to happen to me and my family? So maybe they have a good idea, but they're just kind of afraid to do it, even though they have the capital. Basic income alters that. So you're more likely to start a business. But I think the big thing is that you're creating customers in addition to entrepreneurs when it comes to basic income. So that's how to that's the difference between a store opening and then closing, a year later because you didn't have the customers. Like you can have a good idea, providing a good product or service and fail, not because it was a bad idea, but because people just couldn't buy it. They
For
didn't
yeah.
have the discretionary income to handle it. So I think that's a huge thing when it comes to starting up new businesses is actually making sure that people have that consumer buying power. And I also think it just makes a difference with like creativity, like all the ideas besides entrepreneurship, but like creative ideas, artistic ideas. Um, you know, if if you can actually focus on something that you're passionate about, um, I think that work will improve. That's incredible work. People are intrinsically motivated to do it. There's a passion there. And if we have more people doing that intrinsically motivated work that they're passionate about, I think all of us are going to be better off as a result. And for those who worry about, oh, well, what about people, what about the jobs that people don't want to do? Again, great. Those jobs need to pay more. Like if there's a job that most people don't want to do, that should be the job that pays the most. Like there should be janitors out there with CEO salaries and
Yes.
like CEOs with like janitor
Sorry.
salaries. Like that's all flipped. Um, and then so um, when it comes to that, where was I going with that one? Um,
About setting up businesses or yes.
right, right. When it comes to, oh, right, when it comes to people actually, when it comes to jobs needing to pay more, um, that actually incentivizes automation too. And then that gets back to, what we can talk about with automation, like what's the point of it? If basic income leads to more automation of these jobs that people don't want, I think that's a great thing. If we're currently automating jobs that people don't want, and then people don't have a basic income, then you're just making people worse off, and you're even hurting the economy because people have less buying power. So that's like the difference between making technology and automation work for all of us versus it actually harming society.
And just connected with that and connected with the UBI, the idea we're seeing more and more automation, we're seeing AI take over. What do you see in the future where, with it, where people don't have any jobs to do, but they're receiving an AI, receiving a UBI? How do we see society changing with that, going down that road?
Yeah, so here too, there's like a difference between a non-UBI society and a UBI society with and without AI. So if you have a rapidly automating society with AI and you don't have UBI, then people don't have that buying power to actually even buy from or buy human labor, even if it existed. If you make sure that buying power is maintained and people can actually spend their money, there will always be jobs for people. Like uh, I especially love good sushi. Like that's one of my favorite things. Like on my birthdays, I'll go out and enjoy some really good sushi. Um, I'm always going to choose to do that with a human. Like robotic sushi, that's already cheap. Like you can go into a grocery store and buy cheap robotically created sushi. Is that something that you want? Well, if you're looking for just a cheap and quick meal, that's a great option. But if you're looking for like something special, you're going to want human-made sushi or any other product or service. So with basic income, you make sure that people can actually signal that, and you're actually going to create more jobs and prevent the loss of these jobs as long as you can maintain that spending power. So I don't think that, with AI, we're not going to be looking at a society where no one can work, especially if you have UBI, because then you're able to create those jobs and you're able to, even engage like in a kind of a gift economy kind of situation. Like if you have two people doing intrinsically motivated work, then you actually, they can choose to just give it away for free to each other. That's kind of like the way humans used to operate, like way
Yes.
back in the day. So we could kind of go back to that a little bit. Um, it's just kind of like looking at the economy differently and enabling and recognizing unpaid work too is a big thing. It's like it's kind of weird how, right now you could have two paid care workers watching each other's kids, each earning, I don't know, $60,000 a year or something. It's to do that. And GDP recognizes that. But if you like provide a basic income that's high enough for them to watch their own kids and care for their own kids, then GDP drops by, $120,000 if they're each getting $60,000. And but is it better off? Like the kids are going to be happier, the families are happier, and people are just doing it because they want to. I think that's a good outcome, but we actually have to think about like the economy differently in that respect.
We're almost at the end, but I'd like to quiz you on what can we do as individuals to encourage politicians to to take on board the concept of UBI and really consider it as a way forward.
I think what matters is how people vote, like it has to be like a make or break kind of issue. There are other make or break issues that politicians know that they have to support or oppose, depending on, whether if they win or not. And so basic income has to become that important to voters. If a candidate feels that they have to support basic income in order to win, then they will. Um, and again, that goes to, funding of elections too. Like if the people funding the elections don't want a basic income, it's not going to happen. But if the people funding the elections do want basic income, it's going to happen. So you can either have elites also, like in the wealthy, support basic income, in which case it's more likely, or you can modify and reform voting systems so that it actually appeals or responds more to everyone else, to the vast majority of voters, then it'll respond in that way. So when it comes to that logic too, you're looking at, well, why would the wealthy support basic income? Well, like when it comes to AI, uh, I think a lot depends on where their business comes from. Like if they're looking at a situation where they're going to lose customers, basic income makes sense for that person to support it. Even if they don't want to pay higher wages, like they're going to be choosing, do I want my business to go out of business or do I want to pay more in wages? So that's one factor. But really, I think it's just up to all of us to really start demanding this, talking about it, making sure that it's a part of every conversation. Like when I see universal healthcare in the US, I think that it should always be like universal healthcare and basic income, like these two things. It should be as often spoken about, one or the other. So in the UK, same kind of thing. Like if you're talking about improving the national healthcare service, um, part of that needs to be basic income. Like if you have a healthier society, you're going to expend less resources on national healthcare. And so from that way, you're going to save money, and those two go hand in hand. Uh, and just whatever policies you can, these kind of like steps toward it, support those. I don't think that you have to support, the perfect version and then everything else is bad. There's just so many different policies where you can do steps toward basic income, and those improvements can help people and politicians think differently about universal basic income.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Scott. The name of the book again, if you want to show it up on screen.
Yeah, it's Let There Be Money.
Fantastic. And we can find that on Amazon. Perfect. So do check it out, guys, if you haven't already. So it'd be great to have you back on sometime in the future. Maybe we can discuss how UBI is progressing, and hopefully we have some more politicians willing to take it on board. So it was a pleasure talking to you today, Scott. So if there's anything you'd like to say before we go.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of UK listeners here, so check out the basic income organizations in the US. I think maybe makes less sense to check out itsafoundation.org and what we're doing in the US, but just do whatever, look for join a local group, help out local organizations. That's a great way to help.
Wonderful. Thanks a lot.